This is Robbie Ward with the Greenville News, reporting on the modern uh, protest, the modern protest movement, with events in Ferguson, Missouri that have spread throughout the country. We've started to see a more of a high-tech element to protest, and here with me to discuss this is Bridget Todd. She's a digital media analyst. Currently, she works for MSNBC.com as a social media editor. Prior to that, she worked for the New Organizing Institute, where she trained progressive organizations with best practices to incorporate into protests and social movements and issues. Bridget, I certainly appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and certainly with you in your role now at MSNBC.com as a social media editor, and in your previous professional life as a social media, digital world best practices type of person in the context of politics, you see both sides of those working to affect change, but also the media side of things that tend to be the traditional media through cable news and things along that line. Well, for people out there who have associated in their minds the idea of a protest involving people going to a picket line and marching, or maybe speaking or shouting a chant or some type of message, how has the protest movement evolved from even 10 years ago?
Well, I think that's a great question. The way, in my mind, I would say it's changed in a couple of fundamental ways. One, I would say is probably the most obvious and the most practical, is that it's really made it easier for people in protests, whether you're in Ferguson, Missouri, or elsewhere around the globe. It's made it easier for people to communicate with each other. People here in my apartment in New York, I could be communicating with someone on the ground in Ferguson, somewhere else in the city, really quickly, really easily via social media. And it really makes it easier to communicate with large groups of people, to coordinate logistics, to coordinate plans. All of that is made tremendously faster, tremendously more effective, and tremendously easier via social media. When you think about things like protest and sort of these kinds of uprisings socially, I think that people tend to think of them as these things that are very meticulously planned out and sort of, meticulously planned ahead of time. But because of social media and digital media and the internet, you can really just plan something quickly, spur of the moment. Say we're going to meet at such and such place at such and such time, and start a hashtag and get it out there, and really have it be effective in the way that it probably would never have been, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So that's one I think is, kind of obvious and sort of logistically very important. Two, I would say, and this one I think is more kind of nuanced, is the ability for really anyone to really sort of have a stake or have a claim over the narrative of protest. I think that in the past, people watching at home had to sort of rely on like what the newspaper said to sort of report on like what was going on in the streets and what was going on in this protest. Now, thanks to things like live tweeting, live streaming, Vine, these videos that you can upload very quickly from your phone, and everybody has a phone, you can sort of be more in control of the narrative of what's happening on the street, and you don't have to rely on like one organization, one media source, one person to tell that story. It really allows really anybody and everybody to be the storyteller of what's going on.
Well, it's interesting that you say that people who engage in the live streaming, you know, even tweeting while at uh, protests such as the Ferguson um, area, or even the Occupy Wall Street. Um, it, it seems that live streaming events has uh, a real possibility of um, taking in situations and environments of broadcast by the protester uh, to actually take that footage or event completely out of context and to um, and to present it in a way that doesn't reflect reality. Do you think that there's also a negative, a concern uh, with social media to be able to present this unfiltered view of things? Um, Sometimes maybe easily taken out of context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's definitely a concern, but I think that's a concern with any kind of media, whether it's social media, whether you're live streaming something just via your cell phone as it happens, or whether you're watching something, you know, on a television screen, from a news channel. I think that there's always that possibility. But I also think that with kind of things like live streaming, it's much more you have a much more ability to sort of let the viewer make up their own mind and say like this is what my phone captured, and if someone else got a different reality or a different narrative, it's sort of like crowdsourcing in terms of the narrative that you wanna believe. And so I do think that that's certainly a concern, sort of saying, is this presenting an unfiltered reality? But I also think that with social media, you're getting a much truer understanding of what's actually happening in real time, and that people are sort of just left to either A, make up their own minds about what's going on and what they're seeing and what that means in context, or B, they themselves, like with social media, really anybody's a journalist, anybody can document these things. And so if you watched someone live streaming, you know, events in Ferguson and you thought like, oh, this is not how it's going down, I don't agree with this. You yourself, there's nothing stopping you yourself from going and like telling the story that you think is more accurate. And so I think it's really sort of the democratization of discourse where really everyone's voice is really out there.
Well, and oftentimes, well, protests, their very nature, are intended to disrupt the status quo. How important, or what value does the new technology like social media or 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 live streaming, what value does that bring in terms of amplifying the message and bringing people directly to certain events? I mean, how important is it to to amplifying their message to the broader audience?
Oh, I think it's immensely important. I think that that's why you're seeing this sort of like unrivaled kind of activism that we really haven't seen in the last 10 years. I think it's really things are really coming to a head now, and I think that that's part of it. I think that social media, I think, makes things really difficult to ignore. I think that when you have, you know, people going to Ferguson or really anywhere and getting incredible footage of things that are happening, you can't ignore that. I think it makes it difficult for your average person who's not there to ignore sort of what's going on. And so it's much harder to encapsulate this as like, oh, these are just a bunch of kids starting trouble wherever. It's harder to think that when you're seeing it everywhere. You can't ignore the kind of footage that people are getting. And again, I also think it's really about sort of leveling the playing field of who has the power. I think that social media is immensely powerful in that regard, right? That like the kinds of experiences that people are having, if they're able to document them in real time and disseminate them to lots of people quickly, I think that it really kind of tips the scales of who has power. I think social media is all about sort of getting power into the hands of people who for a long time have really been kind of largely powerless against sort of larger power structures.
Right, and um, I really think that it's such a empowering experience when people can take a smartphone or some other device readily available to them, and bam, they can broadcast their experience to the world. Uh, Given the nature of your role at a major cable news network, d- does do the live streamers, the protesting, the democratization um, of media outlets, does that make the traditional news organizations irrelevant?
I mean, I would say it depends on the news outlet, but I would say absolutely not, right? Like I think that it's about adapting. It's about being willing to say, like, digital media is the future of journalism, perhaps. That's certainly what I believe. And I think it's about sort of just finding ways to integrate that and sort of not being afraid of it and not denying it, but sort of learning how to integrate it to really, you know, get people get people the information that they need. I think it only makes information better. I think it only makes, you know, traditional journalism smarter, better, faster. I think there's absolutely room to integrate them.
And well, I know that when the announcement 2 Mondays ago um, brought the news that no indictment would would go criminal action against the police officer in Ferguson. I spent much of the evening um, side by side with my computer and with my television watching cable news, but also watching live streams. Um, how do you think that these two mediums can help complement each other?
Yeah, I mean, much like you, I spent the evening really the same way, right? Like one eye on, the live stream. And I think that I think things like live streams force those of us who are in media positions to really be on their toes and really sort of be flexible enough to say, like, we may have an idea of how this story is going to play out, but I think it allows the story to really dictate what happens and not the other way around. Like, it's not us sort of deciding, what the narrative is going to be. It's really that narrative. It really allows us to watch that narrative unfold and really, however it's going to, take shape is how it takes shape. And we have to be flexible and fluid enough to really stay on top of it, I think. And I think I think it's a challenge, but I think it's one that, certainly any sort of savvy media organization, you have to do it. I mean, if you think about things like, I know it was a while ago now, but like the Boston bombing, but the evening that the suspect was apprehended, that was an evening where I really think you saw digital media taking off in terms of how stories are reported, right? Like you had this people listening to police scanners, people reporting, using Twitter to report what was going on in real time, people who were there from their window live tweeting what they were seeing, right? Like I think that being fluid enough to know when to step back and say, this story is unfolding, it's happening before our eyes, and being, flexible enough to allow social media to really tell that story is just supremely important.
Well, I know that significant amount of your time previous to your role now at MSNBC.com involved training people in using social and digital media to um, complement their physical demonstrations and protests. And we often hear about how that can help amplify their message, but there's also the I guess the vulnerabilities that that same digital and social media can expose people. Um, so, what are some of the concerns that social media, live streaming, um, tweeting, any other uh, technology that we use? What are some of the threats or vulnerabilities that people could face if they're not careful with it?
Well, I think that there. like anything, I think that there's always sort of threats or sort of just ways to be careful. I think that probably the biggest one is it makes it kind of like what I was saying before. It makes it very difficult to to have a lot of control over the narrative. And I think when I've trained organizations and activists and folks like that, you always want to be in control of your narrative. And I think once you're on digital media, it makes it a lot harder to maintain that control. And I think this because the story can be whatever the story is. And so if you're doing an event and a provocateur shows up, or if you're doing an event and like something happens that you would rather not happen, there really is a threat of like you can't really stop that story from unfolding. And so I do think there's a threat of not being able to have complete control over the message and the narrative and the frame. But I think that like through training, through sort of staying on your toes, you can really combat that. And so you can really think quickly about how you're going to respond if things sort of don't go your way. But it happens. I mean, it happens all the time when someone, has a digital campaign and it just gets, it doesn't go the way they want, or it gets, taken over by someone else, or it gets, their message gets drowned out, or their narrative gets changed in a way they don't want. So I think it's definitely a risk, but I think with careful planning and sort of, again, staying on your toes, I think it can be, managed pretty succinctly.
Yeah, and it seems that as easily accessible as this new media is to just almost anyone, anyone with access to a smartphone or a computer, it requires that much more savvy to pull it off and to, I guess, defend your narrative, because there's a whole other digital world out there to attack it for those people who oppose whatever you stand for.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's always a threat. I think it takes very careful planning. I think that probably one of the biggest misconceptions about sort of using digital media for political purposes, for protest, for social movements, is that you can do it without, because it's online, it means that you don't have to have careful planning and things like that. While that may be true for a spur-of-the-moment protest where, you just tweet, if you're angry, meet at such and such place and we'll march together, it's certainly not true that it doesn't take careful planning to, put out a good digital campaign. And I think that, I think that you're absolutely right that it's certainly a risk. And I think that risk can be countered with just remembering that just because it's online doesn't mean it has to be rushed or sloppy. It still needs to be strategic.
Yeah, well, and for just people out there interested in learning about some type of protest or movement, whether it's in the United States or such as with Ferguson, there are similar demonstrations in Chicago, Detroit, New York, just throughout the country. If people want to see the unfiltered version of things that maybe they don't think they always would receive from some of the traditional media sources, how do they find some of these channels that would expose them to the unvarnished reality?
That's a great question. I think it's certainly a challenge. I would say, for me, I think Twitter was really immensely helpful. I think that when stories happen, sort of being able to identify who are the local folks on the ground, and I don't mean the people who just flew there, because they heard something was happening. Who are the people who have been doing work on the ground in these communities for a while? I would say that I would certainly put my trust in them to get the unfiltered story first. And so I think it's interesting that if you look at an example like Ferguson, at this point, this is not coming from a place of I think I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I think that in Ferguson, there are people who don't live in Ferguson who have come there because they believe in something and because they want to be part of this movement. But I think there are community organizations doing sort of organizing and activist work in Ferguson before Mike Brown ever met his death. And I think that really being able to do a little research and say, like, who are the people who have been building, working, and growing and organizing in these communities before people kind of rush to them, and really sort of putting a lot of faith into what they have to say, I think is really important. I also think being able to pay attention to sort of hyper local media sources, not just the newspaper in your town, but like, does your town have a city paper? Does your town have an alternative paper? Does your town have a online message board that maybe you don't know about? Is there where are people getting their information, and sort of at the super hyper local levels in certain communities, I think is really helpful.
And kind of from your perspective, from the grassroots organization to the cable television online world, what impact do you think that the social media emerging technology is going to have on democracy? Are we going to see new ways for people to engage in ways they never thought existed?
Absolutely, 100% yes. I would answer that with a resounding yes, and I would even say we're already seeing it, right? Like, I think that social media has really changed discourse and really democratized it in a way that people who before maybe didn't feel like they had a lot of power can take back some of that power. And so whether it's by using Twitter to physically get people out to protest, right, or to physically get people to shut down a highway or something, you can also sort of start a hashtag if you're upset about something and sort of see real results. And I think that a misconception is that this is only things that you can do like when you're upset or when you're angry or when you want to shake things up. Quite the contrary. I would say that, like, really, I reject the idea that sort of civic engagement is on sort of one end of this, and that and that's completely separate from like digital media. I think that digital media and social activism and social movements really is about civic engagement and sort of good government. I think that one of the most interesting things that I saw come out of Ferguson was that people used social media to get people to donate to the Ferguson Library after all of the unrest happened, right? Like, things like that. Like, if it wasn't for social media, that could not have happened so effectively, right? Like, after Mike Brown's death, a bunch of teenagers, I think in Detroit, built an app for people to rate their interactions with police as they happen. So if I was walking down the street and a cop stopped me, I could then go and rate that interaction and say, like, this cop was polite and personable and reasonable, or whatever else I had to say. And I think that, like, this idea that sort of the people running governments and the people in charge and people using digital media are at odds, I think is wrong. I think that really, if you have an integration of these two, everybody wins, right? And so I think that's when civic engagement wins, when you have digital media, people who are interested in shaping their democracy be it through protest or through digital media, and people with power, government officials, police, whatever. When there's an integration between all of these stakeholders, I think really everybody wins.
Yeah, and and so as more people look to live streaming and social media to help fill out their diet of news uh, for whatever issue that's important to them, I suspect that people will need to have a healthier, even healthier dose of skepticism, or at least awareness of from which the news medium they watch. Um, and and so how 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 so beyond just doing the basic research uh, on an online source, is there anything else that the casual viewer needs to do before really buying into what they see for themselves on a broadcast?
I mean, that's such a good question. I would say, your basic research is always important. Yeah, I would say I mean, I don't know if this really answers your question, but something that, and just personally, that I've always found very helpful is not being afraid to get the same story from multiple sources, and whether those sources have, whether you suspect those sources have competing agendas or competing whatever, it can only help you to have multiple vantage points of one story. So I would say not being afraid, like not reading a story and saying like, oh, I got it, and just taking for granted that you understand it. Being willing to sort of read the same story from multiple points and sort of getting a sort of broader idea of sort of what's being said. I often, one of my sort of pitfalls is that I read a story and I say like, oh, I got what's going on there, and then I'll read the same story from a different source and say like, oh, well, this is completely different. Like, how did I ever think that I had the full story? And so I would say it may sound a little bit silly, but really being willing to, you know, get it from multiple points.
Right. Well, I know that this is a topic that's going to continue as more opportunities exist for people to share their experiences and anything from politics to their personal lives, and we get to see things from the traditional gatekeepers of news organizations such as cable television or newspapers, but we'll also have the unfiltered outlets as well. So I appreciate you taking a few minutes to speak with me about this.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Bridget, and uh, have a great evening.
You too.